People have been led to believe that mediocrity is excellence.
Say a lie enough times, and people start to believe it's true. Over the last 5 or 7 years, there's been a fascinating piece of discourse in the air that Chris Jericho just might be the GOAT. Now, of course, I've been very clear on my own stance on who I believe to be the greatest wrestler of all time, so it shouldn't be a surprise that I disagree with this particular statement. So why bother with this video? The thing is that I don't think Chris Jericho actually has a very convincing case towards being the greatest wrestler of all time. To me, the hype surrounding him seems so detached from the actual work that Chris Jericho has put in through the decades. I feel like someone who's been so propped up as a potential candidate for greatest of all time should have their career closely examined and picked apart, and if you ask me, when you do that, Jericho's career simply doesn't hold up to the standard that one would expect from the greatest wrestler of all time. But more on that as we go along. First, how did I go about making this video? I've been watching wrestling since 2006, so you better believe that I've already watched my fair share of Chris Jericho matches, both big and small. But in the interest of good faith, I wanted to re-examine as much of his most significant work through the years as possible. To cover as many eras of Chris Jericho as I could. That way I'd have a much better overview of how his career turned out as a whole, as well as the chance to observe his abilities on a match-to-match level. For the purposes of this project, I watched 97 Chris Jericho matches, and that doesn't even account for all the Jericho matches I've simply seen as a fan through the years. As such, this video will focus primarily on Chris Jericho's creative work in the ring. One of the more common points brought up in wrestling discourse is drawing power, and I really don't put a lot of stock in that. I've explained it before, but my decision on that mostly comes down to the fact that wrestling isn't and never has been a meritocracy. The most success doesn't always follow the most capable and most talented. Instead, I want to focus on the performance aspect of Chris Jericho's case, as those are the things he has the most control over, and they also happen to be the factors that I personally care about most as a fan. If Chris Jericho is your own pick for greatest of all time, I truly doubt I will sway you with anything I say in this video. Honestly, that's fine. I really don't think this will convince anyone. It's just my own way of getting the thoughts and frustrations I've had about this wrestler's legacy into one place. If anything, it's a critical exercise into how I evaluate a wrestler's creative achievements, especially when aiming for the loftiest possible standard of greatest of all time. Long story short, it's just my opinion. I didn't think that needed to be said, but it's the internet, so whatever. Onwards we go. Part 1. How did we get here? It's near impossible to pin down how things like Chris Jericho as the greatest of all time really take root among fans, especially for myself, given that the general wrestling discourse circles I'm in have pretty handily dismissed Jericho from that discussion long ago. I'll give you guys an example. The two most notable fan-driven greatest wrestler ever projects that I'm personally aware of are the ones done in 2006 by Smark's Choice, which then became the genesis for the 2016 Pro Wrestling Only Greatest Wrestler Ever project. Now, keep in mind that these are projects run by people who care enough to argue and discuss at length on forums, which means I think it's fair to say we're not exactly dealing with any kind of mainstream consensus as far as these lists are concerned. Jericho did rank on both lists of the top 100 wrestlers ever, coming in at number 80 in 2006, and then improving his position in 2016 to number 73. In the 2016 GWE, Jericho was named on 71 ballots, with his highest ranking on any ballot being number 16. Anecdotally, I think the Chris Jericho as GOAT fervor was probably at its strongest around 2019, coinciding with his early run in AEW. And from that perspective, it makes sense. A wrestler that was generally liked for most of his career got to spread his wings in a late career run outside of the comforts of the WWE, and even get a significant world championship run to reward him for his efforts. Being at the forefront of AEW's first year helped put a lot of positive shine on Jericho in 2019, and Wrestling Observer newsletter voters crowned him the Wrestler of the Year, his third time winning that award after back-to-back victories in 2008 and 2009, 2 years that represent the peak of his abilities in my personal opinion. I think it's also interesting how the title of GOAT has bled into Jericho's on-screen presentation. The seeds of it come around 2008, when Jericho begins calling himself the best in the world at what he does. Again, coinciding with his most successful reinvention and him really putting together his abilities to produce the best work of his career yet. It's also in 2009 that Jericho won his record-setting 9th Intercontinental Championship, which, compounded with all his on-paper accolades in the WWE through the years, lent him an air of credibility on the roster that was difficult to match. One of the most notable achievements of Jericho's career, after all, is being able to stick with the WWE long enough to see notable stars rise and fall, and generally having the chance to work with all of them. As such, he's bound to receive some prestige from fans by association alone. It's around 2016 that Jericho embraces the term GOAT as an official part of his act. I'm not sure why, to be perfectly honest. I was a lot more detached from wrestling discussion in 2016 than I am now, so I don't know where the general thoughts on Jericho were at the time. Surely someone must have gotten it into his ear because he starts taking on the label with pride. And I don't blame him for doing so, really. Jericho's always had an eye for labels, nicknames, things that he can meme, and it's really not the most audacious thing for a wrestler to say that they're the GOAT. Jericho, at that point in his career, at least had the achievements on paper and the tenure to not look like a total goof saying it, as much as I may beg to disagree with the label. He refers to himself as that in promos, he has it emblazoned on his gear, it becomes a talking point about him, not just among fans, but also among his kayfabe rivals. A lot of Jericho's opponents in his post-WWE run parrot back the idea that Jericho might just be the greatest of all time. There's no telling whether those wrestlers believe that to be the actual case, or if they're just hyping up an opponent in a promo, as one is meant to do, but it does create an atmosphere where suddenly many credible people in the industry are saying that Jericho could just be the best to ever do it.
Me, I look at this man, and I legitimately, you can't ever really pick a greatest of all time in wrestling. It's just too long of a discussion. There's too many people on the list. But for me, for my money, Chris Jericho is really making a case for being the greatest of all time. He's done it in the 90s and the 2000s, in the last 2 decades. He's doing it again. He's doing something completely new and breaking new barriers still here in 2020 with AEW.
It's an odd thing, a whole mix of different factors that came together to help impart to fans that Jericho could be the greatest. It's impossible to pin it down to one thing. It's all of them. The nostalgia for the Attitude Era, the constant presence of Jericho on mainstream wrestling television, Jericho's own marketing and self-branding, incorporating GOAT status into his character, and the voices of Jericho's peers in the locker room parroting back the same talking points. So now let's take a stab at picking apart and examining how well that case really stacks up. While this video essay hasn't quite heated up with the hot takes just yet, it's time to pay the bills. For more video essays about pro wrestling, yearly retrospectives, wrestler breakdowns, and the Walking the King's Road series, be sure to subscribe to the channel right now. If you're enjoying so far, leave us a like, drop a comment down below, and punch that notification bell so you never miss another video. Now, back to the essay. Part 2. Chris Jericho is not a GOAT-level worker. This is going to be the core of my argument against Chris Jericho, given that I watched his matches from all across his career in various different promotions. And in terms of quality, Jericho feels like he was a great wrestler in the ring for a shorter period of time than he was either average or outright bad. So let's start at the very top, just so we have some clear signposts to mark where I'm coming from. Based on what I've seen, Jericho's best ever career years in terms of in-ring product are 2000 and 2009. Now, between those 2 years, I'd say that 2009 is when we actually see Chris Jericho as his very best self as a performer. His matches against Rey Mysterio represent the peak of Chris Jericho's abilities as a performer. These are matches where I look at Jericho's performances and find practically nothing to complain about. He's brutal on offense, thoughtful in match structure, and he bases well for Rey's high flying. Now, if I'm going to be as generous here as possible, I think one could say that Jericho was a good to great worker between 2000 and 2009. While he has several great matches in this time frame, I still have a few criticisms of his general performance that we'll get to that keep me from saying that it's a full decade of greatness. Rather, I'd say that in this time frame, Jericho was capable of greatness, but only really embodied it fully in mid-2009. As for the worst years of his career, I'd say that around 2013 or 2014, Jericho becomes noticeably worse in the ring. That's not entirely his fault. It's clear that physically, he simply wasn't what he used to be at his peak, and that's greatly affecting what he can do in the ring. But at the same time, he lacks the awareness and savvy to work around those issues brought about by this change in any smart and compelling ways. While there's occasional good work to be found from 2014 onwards, it's almost impossible to look at any of his individual performances after 2014 and call Jericho a good worker. And at his worst, he's an outright bad wrestler that puts on some of the worst matches in mainstream professional wrestling, regardless of who he's in the ring with. While late 2010s to present day Jericho might represent him at his very worst, I can't help but say that his pre-WWF days aren't that far behind as far as quality is concerned. Honestly, going back to watch Jericho in Japan and WCW might have been the most revealing part of this project, as that time of his career is often held up as some of Jericho's best work, or at the very least, he's painted with the same broad strokes as the rest of the revolutionary WCW Cruiserweight division. When that famed division is brought up, many fans lump in Jericho with the likes of Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio Jr., and Chris Benoit, and yeah, no, Jericho's not anywhere near as good as any of those other names in his time in WCW. Jericho shared their success because of his willingness to put himself out there with outlandish comedic promos and storylines, but in the ring, he simply was not up to snuff with any of his contemporaries. I'm assured by people I trust that Jericho has at least one great match in WCW, but from my perspective, it's not really any of the ones he's most famous for. I didn't love the Juventud matches, the Malenko matches, and even Eddie or Benoit struggled to get something truly great out of Jericho. In fact, of the matches I saw from this time period, the only ones I'd consider particularly great are a singles match against Eddie Guerrero from Fall Brawl 97, and then a tag team match where Jericho teamed with Eddie against Chavo and Malenko on the February 9th, 1998 edition of Nitro. Part of the reason I bring this timeline up is because I want to pick apart one of the key aspects of Jericho's GOAT case, which is his longevity. To me, longevity shouldn't just mean being around forever, but rather putting in high-quality, excellent work for the duration of one's career. I don't think Jericho's run in the 2000s particularly stands out in terms of length on its own, volume of great matches within, or peaks of great matches within either. Jericho's claim to longevity falls apart when you start to see that the times in which he could be considered a great worker are far shorter than the times he's spent in a major national spotlight as a whole. But okay, let's really get into the weeds and talk about some specifics of his ring work here. Number 1. Chris Jericho's physical execution is mid. Again, this is primarily a problem in Jericho's pre-WWF days when he's meant to have built his reputation off being one of the workhorses of the WCW Cruiserweight division. The truth is, he's not really on the level of the other innovative cruiserweights of the time. It wouldn't be such a problem if Jericho wasn't pigeonholed into that workhorse role, but it's very noticeable when you go back to watch his stuff. For most of the 1990s, Chris Jericho tries desperately to keep up with the athletic achievements of his contemporaries and simply cannot keep up. He's just not as smooth, especially when attempting some of his more reckless dives. Unfortunately, they're not reckless in the sense that they look dangerous and spectacular for the opponent, more reckless in that it doesn't look like Jericho's ever been able to pull them off safely and successfully. More often than not, he simply doesn't look like he belongs in the ring with the actual workhorses of that era. His ring work greatly improves in the WWF, and things generally tighten up, plus he's able to transition to a more main event heavyweight style that doesn't see him having to always race to catch up with talents far more physically gifted than him. Even then, he still struggles to match the kind of intangible, raw charisma of his peers in the late Attitude Era, such as The Rock, Stone Cold, and even Triple H. It's no shock that it was only in the WWF that his ring work really started to shine, though. Jericho himself, in his book Undisputed, writes about how entering the WWF was a complete shock to the system. He references a constant struggle to deliver in the ring in his early WWF years and cites Pat Patterson as the person who really helped him tighten up his ring work. Jericho writes,
Pat is a wrestling Jedi and the smartest man I have ever met in wrestling. He taught me 90% of what I know about how to put together a match, and when I first approached him, I had no idea how little I really knew about the psychology of the business. You had to have a crispness with everything that you did in the ring. At the time, when I threw someone off the ropes, I wasn't following through with my arms or putting enough effort into it. Pat pulled me aside and told me that the way I was doing it looked bad and explained the right way to do it. To this day, I still see his face whenever I push a guy off the ropes.
So when I say that Jericho's pre-WWF work isn't up to snuff, just know that there's a part of him that understands that as well. Unfortunately, age does catch up with Jericho, and around 2013 to 2014, he begins to struggle again and is grossly exposed by having to work with younger, quicker talent like CM Punk, Sami Zayn, and Neville. Each time, he's completely outclassed by his younger peer, something that only becomes compounded when entering the far more competitive New Japan sphere in 2018. In no world are 2018 Chris Jericho and 2018 Kenny Omega even remotely on the same athletic level. Like, the man has just always been awkward in the ring. If you don't believe me, try finding spots of him bumping for a dragon screw leg whip. I already criticized how sloppy and ugly his bump for the dragon screw leg whip was when reviewing his matches against Orange Cassidy in 2020, but much to my surprise, he just somehow never knew how to do it in his entire career. He was botching that bump against The Rock in 2001. So it's not a matter of him not being physically capable. Even in his prime as an athlete, he couldn't do it. His awkward bumping is especially bad in the modern day when he's forced to try and base for these quick-moving high flyers. Few things in wrestling were quite as embarrassing as Chris Jericho pretending he belonged in the ring with 2016 AJ Styles, or completely bungling being a base for Sami Zayn's Tornado DDT dive through the ropes in the same year. Number 2. Chris Jericho can't strike for shit. I took notes on every single match that I watched for this project, and I can't tell you the number of times I wrote that Jericho's strikes look god-awful. Specifically, his worked punches can take a fucking walk. I couldn't tell you how it feels to be punched by Jericho in the ring, but as a viewer, they look like the most feather-soft, limp, weightless, downright bad punches I've ever seen from a top-level wrestler that people claim could be the GOAT. His kicks are mostly fine. He's not hitting like Shibata out there or anything, but it's mostly inoffensive. Really, the best strike in his arsenal are his chops. The chops are all pretty decent for the most part through his entire career. Like, we're not talking Roderick Strong or even Ric Flair out here, but they're good chops. The problem is that Jericho only really leans on chops when he's a babyface. I think he specifically tones down the chops when he's a heel because he senses that he gets a pop for hitting them. The problem there, of course, is that, as I mentioned, his punches look awful. And we all know just how much of Jericho's career has been spent as a heel, and thus relying far more on his punches than his chops. Now, to be entirely fair to Jericho, there might be a reason that he isn't hitting like crazy out there. In Undisputed, he tells this story.
Mick Foley told me, "I don't mind if you kick and punch me as hard as you can, but you might not want to be that solid with the other guys. Some of them might complain about getting stiffed the way you stiffed me tonight."
Honestly, I don't know what Mick's getting at here, given that Jericho's strikes in WCW never looked all that great either, but apparently Jericho hits hard enough to warrant a warning from Mick Foley. And yet, instead of figuring out a way to work his strikes to look convincing, he took the route of just doing the worst possible strikes imaginable and hoping no one noticed. It's easy for me to sit here and blame the WWF as a culture and a corporate machine and say they softened up Jericho's strikes because of their house style, but that doesn't account for all the anomalies within that example. Rey Mysterio's kicks look awesome. Bryan Danielson's punches and kicks and elbows. Roman Reigns' punches. Chris Benoit's chops. Even John Cena's fairly standard worked punches carry so much more weight and energy than Jericho's. Hell, even Jericho's contemporaries at the time in Hunter, Rock, Foley, and Austin could all throw decent to great worked punches because they all knew that the WWF house style at the time was built so heavily around them. What this anecdote reads to me as is that Jericho was given political advice, but just didn't have the ability as a worker to translate that into a stronger performance. Sucks for him. And again, it's not like every wrestler in the world throws a top-level, amazing punch, but when we're talking about the potential greatest wrestler of all time, and it's a move that fills up so much time in so many of Jericho's matches, it's a massive point against him. Number 3. Chris Jericho is bad at working heat segments. Chris Jericho is bad as a heel in the ring because nothing he does is able to really elicit sympathy from the audience for the babyface. Really, pay attention to Chris Jericho's matches and watch what happens when he's the one finally in control. This is true for him as both a babyface or a heel, but especially when he's working heel. As soon as he's in the driver's seat, his matches slow to a goddamn crawl. That's because Chris Jericho has never been particularly adept at filling the space in his matches. He's not a talented mat technician, and yet taking things down to the ground is his go-to means of filling up a control segment. Honest to God, he might just be more of a limp rest-hold pervert than Randy Orton. Jericho just gets less flack for it because he'll jump off the ropes by the time it's the finishing stretch. Sometime in the mid-2000s, he decided that his go-to hold on the mat would be some kind of weird half-Nelson clutch that he always slapped on in the sloppiest way possible. It never looked convincing, and he never did anything interesting with it. It's like if Okada's money clip couldn't even be bothered to be a viable finish. Just classic, lazy time-wasting, the most paint-by-numbers TV heel wrestling you'll ever see. It also doesn't help that Jericho's arsenal of moves isn't exactly cohesive. Rarely does anything he does in the first 2 acts of a match do anything to set up the Codebreaker or the Walls of Jericho or even the Judas effect. Like, yeah, he'll do that one double underhook backbreaker, I guess, but is that really a targeted attack on the back for the walls, or is it just incidental? It's hard to say. Jericho's matches rarely have strong narrative through lines in them. But wait, there is one more thing that Jericho does like to do when he's in control in the ring to fill space because he sucks at mat work. He loves to run his mouth. Oh baby, does he love to open his mouth in matches and end up saying absolutely nothing at all. It's not as cloying and melodramatic as the worst of NXT's plot-driven community theater dialogue, but it also lacks the wittiness and charisma of something like Kevin Owens' trash talk. Jericho's verbalizations in the ring are neither cool, threatening, nor funny. It doesn't add flavor to a match, it doesn't reveal character, it's just an ad nauseum repetition made to create noise so that the illusion of charisma and work is being put across to the viewer. Just endless instances of, you see what happens, huh? You see what happens? Ask him, referee. You see what happens? Ask him, referee. You see what happens? You see what happens? You see what happens? You see what happens? Side note, Jericho says that he does this as inspired by Jushin Liger in Japan, which makes this maybe the worst thing that Liger has ever given to the wrestling business. Possibly. Maybe. It's not even cheap heat. It's just lazy. It's literally just making noise to fill space. I wouldn't be so critical of it if I knew Jericho could carry on a heat segment built around just his ring work, but he clearly can't. If this was merely one bad tool in his arsenal, it'd be fine. Instead, it's a crutch that he's been leaning on for so damn long in his career instead of actually learning how to look like he might hurt someone. Number 4. Chris Jericho's selling is average. On the opposite end of the spectrum, has Chris Jericho ever been a truly sympathetic seller in his career? He's not necessarily bad at it, but again, we're talking about Chris Jericho's case to being maybe the greatest wrestler of all time. Can you think of a truly sympathetic and emotive Chris Jericho selling performance? I sure can't, and I watched 97 matches, several of which are great, and several of which are considered canonical classics in his career by many people. Now, I'm not here to say that Jericho's necessarily bad at selling. He's not, really. He's mostly fine. In fact, one of his better abilities as a worker is intrinsically tied to decent selling. Throughout his career, I think Jericho has proved himself to be a rather capable heel tag team worker. Whether it's with Christian or Sammy Guevara in AEW, when Jericho's able to apply his aptitude for comedy towards bumping and stooging in the ring, it's some of the best and most natural work he does. Jericho also does well to take some cool bumps and absorb punishment from his more violent opponents like a Daniel Bryan or a 2000s Triple H. Jericho can take a beating well enough, but when it comes to something a little more nuanced, like long-term limb selling, that's something he's not overly talented at. Selling is an aspect of Jericho's game which you'd really kind of want a GOAT-level worker to excel in that he is merely okay at. Hell, the best selling performance I encountered on this entire project was from Goldberg in the 2003 Bad Blood match. Really think about that. The guy known for squashing people in 3 minutes and allegedly being uncooperative in the ring, he put in a far more realistic and sympathetic limb selling performance than Jericho ever has in his entire career. Number 5. Chris Jericho has never been the better wrestler in a great match. When I think of great matches in Chris Jericho's career, of which there are quite a number, I can't think of any where he is the driving factor of that match's greatness. Again, as I've mentioned many times, he is a good and occasionally great wrestler that has always been capable of having great matches, but I don't think a match has ever been great because of Chris Jericho. When I look at my notes about the best Jericho matches, what stands out instead of Jericho's own performances are things like Benoit's impactfulness, The Rock's forceful charisma, Triple H's sadistic heel work at its peak, Shawn Michaels' bloodletting in one of his better selling performances, Rey Mysterio's insane athleticism and likability, Orange Cassidy's willingness to bump like a maniac. If anything, Chris Jericho becomes a test for other wrestlers to build their GOAT cases instead of the other way around. I know that AJ Styles' case looks much better given how hard he worked to keep his 2016 matches with Jericho all held together through sheer attrition. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Chris Jericho is not bad in all of these matches. In fact, in most of them, he's good and putting his best foot forward. And I think this might be one of the most damning points about Chris Jericho's ring work and his case as the GOAT as a whole. On Chris Jericho's very best night, at the peak of his powers when he does everything right and is 100% maximizing his potential and skill, he's still only ever the second best person in the ring. How can you be the greatest of all time when you can never even be the greatest on any given night? I had actually finished recording this video by the time this match happened, so I wanted to address it here before we go any further. It's a great match, and believe me when I say I did not expect Chris Jericho to have any great matches in 2022. The first thing to address here is that I think it's quite clear this is much more of an Eddie Kingston match than it is a Chris Jericho match. From a narrative standpoint, Eddie has more to gain, and just aesthetically, it's pretty clear that this draws from the wrestling traditions that influence Eddie far more than anything that Jericho has done in his career. That being said, Jericho slots into this match quite well. Physically, he looks better than he has in years. He's genuinely impressive, hoofing Eddie around the ring with suplexes, and to his credit, Jericho takes some pretty gnarly suplex bumps himself in this as well. All his usual shortcuts and shtick stuff is brought to a minimum, with him focusing on actual direct action. He even has clear targets on Kingston's body, going after the injured orbital bone, which lends a little more credibility to the Codebreaker as a finisher. The attack on the orbital bone is especially notable, as he's lasered in on it like Akira Taue in the 1995 Champion Carnival final. I know that may be a lofty comparison for Chris Jericho, putting him in the same breath as Akira Taue, but given who he's in the ring with, and the kind of wrestling that informs Eddie Kingston, I don't think it's a wild stretch to say that that may have directly influenced what was going on here. All in all, Chris Jericho in 2022, he can still have great matches. It's just a matter of how often he remains focused and motivated enough to do so. Part 3. Chris Jericho has been doing the same promo for 20 years, and it kind of sucks. One of Jericho's qualities as a performer that gets talked up the most is his ability on the mic. Jericho's fans and greatest supporters will point to him as a charismatic and effortless performer on the mic while cutting promos. This perception of him also often ties into his reputation as a constantly evolving and changing performer that's always reinventing himself. Yeah, put a pin in that bit, we'll come back to it later. Now here's the thing, if you look at the average Chris Jericho promo from week to week, there's nothing all that impressive about it, really. Content-wise, Jericho hasn't really shaken up his promo game since he first broke into the business in WCW in the 90s. If you look at the promos from some of Jericho's most famous feuds in WCW, you'll find that not only are they ineffective at doing what promos are fundamentally meant to do, but they also set the template for how Jericho would shape promos for the rest of his career. To that end, I'd like to draw your attention to what is probably Jericho's most famous feud from his time in WCW versus Dean Malenko. The feud is often looked to for how it was slow-burned, with Jericho taking constant pot shots at Malenko while Malenko took time off to grieve the legitimate death of his father. All this would then culminate at WCW Slamboree when Malenko won a battle royal to earn a shot at Jericho under the guise of being a luchador called Ciclope and swiftly dethroning Jericho for the Cruiserweight title. The structure of this feud meant that the burden of creating heat and interest for this match fell on Jericho, as he was the one being consistently featured on TV week to week in various promo segments to help hype the match up. The May 4th, 1998 edition of Nitro has a specific example of how bad Jericho was at this time at structuring promos. In this famous segment, Jericho takes potshots at Dean Malenko, his family, and his recently deceased father. It starts with Jericho doing some incredibly tame schoolyard jokes about Malenko before he finally drops that whammy line.
Your father must be rolling in his grave!
Now, you might have seen this segment before, but actually listen to what happens when Jericho drops what's meant to be this incredibly vicious, emotional line.
Your father must be rolling in his grave! You're a disgrace to your family!
You hear that? Neither do I. The crowd doesn't react even a little bit to what's supposed to be the emotional turning point of this entire promo. Probably because there's not a lot about it that's all that creative, clever, or compelling. Jericho continues to spend much of the promo talking about how boring Dean Malenko is and how Dean Malenko can't wrestle. It's shocking to me that Jericho's saying these things, not because they're heat-seeking missiles or anything, but because this is already Jericho well into his first run on national TV, and he's somehow still making the rookie mistake of cutting promos burying his opponent completely with lines like, "You can't wrestle." One of the fundamental principles that most every wrestler is taught about promos is that no matter what way you try to insult or belittle your opponent, you should always avoid belittling their ability in the ring. Promos need to create the illusion that there's an even battle being fought, and to diminish your opponent's ability to win only hurts the both of you in the end. That's why the best promos are able to portray heated, emotional conflicts while still putting over one's opponent. And hey, if you don't believe me about how promos are supposed to work, maybe you might believe multiple-time world champion Chris Jericho. In his first book, Alliance Tale, he writes,
I learned an important lesson. The first of 3 seminal moments in my promo development. I had done an interview about my first match with Bulldog, and I was talking about how old and slow he was, just burying him. I thought it was pretty good, until I walked back to the dressing room and Bulldog stopped me in front of everyone. What the hell are you doing? Yeah, I'm old and everybody knows it, but I want you to think about this. If I beat you, and I will be beating you, then you just got beat by an old man. If you beat me, and you will not be beating me, then you just beat up an old man. If you talk about how much experience I have and then I cheat to beat you, then at least you got beaten by an experienced vet. And if you beat me, well fuck, then you just beat an experienced vet. The way it stands right now, you just pissed all over yourself. You look like a fool either way. He walked away muttering to himself, and I realized he was right. The first big lesson I learned about promos, get your pen out kids, was never totally bury your opponent. You can tell jokes and insult them all you want, but if you don't build them up to some extent, you're just burying yourself.
You're a failure! You could never wrestle! Your brother sure can't wrestle, and your father certainly can't wrestle!
That story came from Jericho's time working in small Canadian territories years before he even made it onto WCW television. Jericho claims he learned his lesson that night in Canada, and yet he somehow doubles back and regresses as part of one of his most famous feuds of the 90s. A feud that, I might remind you, Jericho takes full credit for creatively in his book, something that he calls his WCW masterpiece. In fact, when discussing the particular segment I chose on Nitro, Jericho writes,
I buried his father, Boris, who had been a wrestler and was now actually buried as well.
Wow, really learned your lesson there, Chris. Jericho's reliance on calling his opponents boring and unskilled would follow him into the WWF as well. The whole crux of his debut promo against The Rock is about saving the boring WWF by coming into the company. Ironic, given that The Rock raises a single eyebrow in this promo and completely obliterates Jericho with a nuclear level of charisma that Jericho could only dream of attaining. Jericho leans on that boring insult for a lot of his early WWF career. He'd use it against The Undertaker and even rightfully got in trouble for it backstage. It was even a key narrative point in his early feud with Chris Benoit. And even if we say that this is just Jericho learning early on in his career, why is he saying the exact same thing to Randy Orton in 2007? As a whole, Jericho never really says anything particularly interesting in his promos throughout his career. It's all the standard stuff, so he generally overcompensates with sheer enthusiasm and volume. If he screams his promos out to you loud enough with just the right rhythm, he might convince you that he actually has something interesting to say. Unfortunately for Jericho, he's not The Rock. The Rock never has to care about what he says because no one has as powerful a delivery as him. Jericho just kind of flounders on in his career, regurgitating the same pained points over and over again. Speaking of which, it is kind of amazing just how much of Jericho's career is specifically built around cutting promos on women. It'd be one thing if he regularly did intergender wrestling, or if this was used to get him over as a heel, but somehow the most famous examples of this are Jericho talking to a non-wrestler who can never rightfully compete with him, with Jericho firmly positioned as the babyface. This is most famously seen in the early 2000s when Jericho spewed every sexist slut-shaming insult in The Hack's Guide to Pro Wrestling Promos 101 against Stephanie McMahon. Now, it might be easy to look at that example and think, well, that's just a product of its time. The Attitude Era was filled with awful examples of problematic material from the top down. First of all, that doesn't really excuse the material on its own, just because it was a product of its time. But okay, second of all, even if it did, what's the excuse then for Jericho pulling from that same bag of tricks in October 2021 when talking about Paige Van Zandt? Ah yes, clearly a pro wrestling mastermind that shifts and changes with the evolving needs of his audience. A reverend of reinvention indeed. It's a shame because there are absolutely gems in Jericho's repertoire when it comes to promos. I complained a lot about his run in WCW, but some of his most iconic segments of the time do very much hold up. The list of 1004 holds rules. It's genuinely funny, and Jericho completely owns that segment and puts it over in the best possible way. Simultaneously clever and silly enough to work. And his character work later on in that episode trying to protect the list, yes, that's the good stuff. In that same vein, Jericho in Washington trying to protest his loss to Dean Malenko, also extremely funny. A good use of setting with one of Jericho's more restrained performances that makes the situation even funnier. He is 100% capable of doing good stuff. Then there's his 2008 promos from his first ever major reinvention into suit and tie Jericho. And you know what? These promos are good too. The use of overlong and complicated vocabulary, the much more subdued tone, it all works pretty well to get across the act at the time. And it also helps that Jericho was working with some of the best material of his career. Emotional material that rings with a lot of truth to it, given his history with Shawn Michaels. But even then, Jericho can't always help himself, and in the midst of this 2008 to 2009 heel run, he dips into his bag of memes by bringing back the extended list promo on a random episode of SmackDown. Not that I'm complaining, it is absolutely a good bit, but Jericho's never seen a good thing that he doesn't want to milk absolutely dry. Really though, this isn't a shock when it comes to Jericho and promos. That's because his best ability in this regard, and I say this without irony, is having an eye for memes. Jericho has always had a pretty keen sense of what can be and is over with a crowd, and as soon as he finds it, my god, he will beat that dead horse till the cows come home, or some other mixed farming metaphor. The last 5 or so years of Jericho's career can be fully traced back to his idea. Most notably is his 2016 run in the WWE, where it seemed that all he really could do on the mic was generate these incredibly memeable pieces of comedic content that don't actually mean anything, but are just so damn over. And again, I'm not being ironic when I say it's actually kind of impressive how regularly he was able to do that in 2016. But of course, it could never ever be left on its own, and Jericho beat all those catchphrases into the dirt, milking each one for everything it was worth and more. And really, it's all he could do in 2016 because he sure wasn't having good matches. Jericho's meme-based approach to promos continues to this day in AEW, between a little bit of the bubbly, his theme song, or even fat-faced dipshit. This has always been Jericho's MO. Find one punchline that works, repeat on and on for months, then keep shouting at the top of his lungs till the next nugget of gold, and I use that term very loosely, comes along. It speaks to a performer that leans far more on shtick and sticky memes than crafting anything that endures. It's the difference between a funny backstage promo at Raw one night and something like Dusty Rhodes' Hard Times. Jericho's not trying to build anything that lasts. He's just hopping from one meme to the next, throwing everything at the wall, and waiting to see what sticks. Part 4. Chris Jericho's reinventions are only skin deep. So now we get to one of the most significant tentpoles of Jericho's GOAT conversation. One of the most talked about aspects of his career, the one meant to show that he's a master of longevity, always staying ahead of the times. It's become so attached to Jericho's reputation as a wrestler that he gets billed on TV as the Reverend of Reinvention. In fact, it's even clearly one of the aspects of his career that he takes the most pride in. When talking about his GOAT reputation in a 2021 interview with Two-Man Power Trip, he said,
"That's not for me to say, oh, I'm the GOAT, but if other people say it, it's much appreciated. Thank you. What I think I am one of the GOATs of is longevity and not diversity. That's not the word I'm looking for, but always kind of keeping relevancy, and also just always evolving. The GOAT of evolving. You know, like David Bowie might not be the greatest singer of all time, but he is the GOAT of always changing his character and keeping it fresh and evolving into something different but still being David Bowie at the root of it. And I think it's the same for Chris Jericho, in that I always do change things.
And I don't know, something about this idea has always rung false to me. Like, if we really break things down and look at Jericho's many gimmick changes over the years, the more I find that all that really changes is Jericho's aesthetic, with nothing beneath the surface following along. Jericho has portrayed the same character for over 20 years now, but throws on a different jacket and somehow gets praise heaped on him for it. But let me really try to get into more detail on this front. For me, there's no real significant difference between Chris Jericho as a mid-card cruiserweight heel in WCW to his Y2J character in the WWF. In fact, that was a key part of why he was brought into the WWF in the first place. Vince Russo saw Jericho's comedic abilities on Nitro and vouched for him to become a part of WWF programming. But even as Jericho moves between the face-heel divide, I think he's pretty consistently the Y2J character in his first WWE run, and that should already put an immediate image in your head. He comes out, he does an energetic promo, he drops in his usual catchphrases, he does the talk show. You know the character. You know what I mean when I say that Y2J is pretty much just Y2J for that whole initial run through the late Attitude Era into the mid-2000s. No matter what color Jericho's tights were, that's just who he was. And I also think it's pretty fair to say that whatever small changes Jericho made through that first run, that's not really what people think about when they talk about Chris Jericho's ability to reinvent himself. In fact, since the talking point only really became incredibly loud and relevant in the 2010s or so, there's much more focus on his attempts at transformation later on in his career. So let's talk about the big ones. In 2007, Jericho comes back from hiatus with a new Titantron and short hair. Nothing else about him changes, dude just got a haircut, not sure how I can give him credit for that. But this does set the stage for his biggest and, in my opinion, best reinvention into suit and tie, No Country for Old Men Jericho. Please do not kill me for that comparison, it's one that Jericho himself has made, so I'm only quoting him here. As I mentioned in the promo section, this works because Jericho puts in the effort to negate all the things that had got him so over as a character to begin with. stripped away the loud colors for a suit, toned down his delivery to barely a whisper, filled his promos with words he dug out of a thesaurus instead of whipping out catchphrases. It works. It's good. It's a genuine reinvention. Props to him there. The 2010s run is when things get really weird and amorphous for Jericho's reinventions. It's filled with these little changes that Jericho makes to his presentation without actually trying to change literally anything else about him. There's that brief time in 2012 when he did the ironic babyface return gimmick where he came back and didn't say a word, and that was fun and intriguing, but then that all just kind of vanished once he turned heel on CM Punk and it was just normal heel Jericho again. In 2016, he became Meme Lord Jericho, which, I don't know, man, does he get credit for that? Like, his character in 2016 is just a collection of catchphrases. He does jokes with Kevin Owens and the interviewers, I guess, but Jericho does jokes. That's just always been his thing. I find it hard to classify it as a reinvention because there's really just nothing to it. Even the list of Jericho is just a retread of his 1004 holds gimmick back in WCW. Honestly, I think this criticism applies to every attempt to reinvent himself since then, going all the way into AEW's Le Champion up to today's The Influencer. Like, really stop and ask yourself, what does it mean that Jericho is the influencer? What is he doing on AEW TV that makes it make sense for him to call himself that? Nothing. He's still just Chris Jericho, but if he thinks up some new, cool title and just says it often enough that it's forced to be added to his ring intro, then suddenly he's the most genius, creative, reinventing mind in the world or something. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with how Jericho's approached his career. Consistency is fine. Picking up on things that get over with the crowd is fine. But he's built so much of his reputation off of being good at reinventing himself when all he's really been doing since 2012 is finding new clothes to wear on TV. In fact, I wanted to see how Jericho approached his own philosophy to reinvention. In his book, No is a 4-letter word, Jericho described how he considers reinvention, and it's clear that it's always been entirely about aesthetic and rarely ever about substance. Jericho writes,
I strive to change my look, my catchphrases, my moves, and my character as much as I could, which was important considering I was on television twice a week every week. Pat Patterson used to marvel at my weekly facial hair changes in the early 2000s, a tactic I used to keep my image fresh. Changing even such a small detail helped me to stay creatively stimulated and gave me a different look from show to show. If I didn't change these things up, people would see the same Chris Jericho 104 times a year, and that would get boring fast. Soon, that changing of my facial hair expanded to my hairstyle, my wrestling gear, my raps on the way down to the ring, everything. It was a smart move, both from a keeping it fresh standpoint and from a business one as well, because the more pairs of tights I wore, the more action figures they made of me.
The entire chapter I took that quote from breaks down Jericho's various reinventions in his own words, and I don't think it should surprise any of you that for most, not all, but definitely most, of the reinventions, he focuses simply on what new gear he wore, his hairstyle, and his catchphrases. At that rate, every single wrestler that's ever debuted new gear at any point of their career deserves points for reinvention. Hell, I deserve points for reinvention every day of my life that I put on a new outfit. There's nothing new to watch, only something shiny and different, like a light-studded jacket, to distract from the fact that it's just the same old Chris Jericho under all the god-awful eye makeup. And speaking of eye makeup, let's talk about the Painmaker, shall we? Be honest with me now. What is the Painmaker? Other than eye makeup and a spiky jacket. It's not like Jericho wrestles any differently when he's the Painmaker, does he? I mean, sure, in his first few dates in Japan, there's a little more emphasis on crowd brawling, I'll give him that. But then after that, like, what is it? His match against Okada in Osaka-jo Hall might be one of the worst modern New Japan main events of all time, and that's not exactly a match I'd call a brawl either. Like, outside of being put into gimmick matches, the Painmaker is a purely aesthetic choice. A bad one, might I add, that adds nothing to Chris Jericho as a wrestler. If anything, it detracts from him because the look is just so distractingly bad. The Painmaker might just be the most frustrating of his so-called reinventions because he's on record about what influences he's drawing from here. He's constantly talking about the Painmaker being influenced by famed foreigners that made their names in Japan, like Bruiser Brody or Stan Hansen. But what Jericho failed to realize is that those names made themselves famous in Japan by feeling wild, brutish, dangerous, unpredictable. Jericho sees that and puts in the effort to throw over a table at a press conference or something, but still makes his entrance at the Tokyo Dome in the calmest possible pace. He still throws the weakest punches you've ever seen, and he never feels actually dangerous in the ring at any point. Even the little things he does in this run, like grabbing the camera from the cameraman so he can film himself flipping someone off, that isn't new. That's a trick he pulled from his career way back in the 2000s. And again, there's nothing wrong with recycling material and reincorporating it into a new context. But what about taking the camera away and filming yourself giving the finger is meant to elicit this rough and rugged foreigner heel brawler that he so badly wanted to be? Nothing. It's not dangerous at all. It's just another little piece of character work that he uses to fill space instead of actually committing to the character he wants to portray. Like, you can count the Painmaker as a reinvention if you want, maybe factor in those pre-taped promos he would do for New Japan, but when the new character is this bad, I feel like that's a strike against Jericho and not a point for him. In fact, the only time I'd ever praise anything Jericho did that was Painmaker adjacent would be his death match against Nick Gage on Dynamite. Straight up, Chris Jericho didn't need to be in a death match. He didn't need to bleed that much. He didn't need to take those light tubes. So hey, props to him for going out of his way to do that. Good job, Chris. Have a cookie. But none of those things have anything to do with whatever the hell Painmaker is meant to be as a character, gimmick, whatever. It's just Jericho changing his clothes because he was put into a death match. And the innate stylistic change of the setting does far more for Jericho introducing new wrinkles to his character than anything to do with whatever the hell he thinks the Painmaker is. I mean, even if Jericho won, didn't really look like he made Nick Gage experience too much pain, if you ask me. Reinvention for Chris Jericho is easy, because it's only ever skin deep. The only real credit he deserves is having enough money from his WWE days to spend on a new wardrobe every few years. Type of guy to paint his condo a new color and tell everyone that he moved. Credits to Simon of Handwork Reviews for that line. And again, I wouldn't be harping on this particular section so much if Jericho himself didn't make it such a loud part of his reputation. And that, in itself, the fact that reinvention is an innate part of his gimmick also kind of rubs me the wrong way. It exposes how forced and manufactured it all really is. Nothing about it stems from organic necessity or actual evolution as a performer or even as a character. Instead, it's all just about making noise so that he stays relevant on TV for another year. And sure, at its core, that's what every wrestler should be doing, getting attention so they get bookings. Fine. I accept that. But a wrestler's career successes and financial successes don't actually mean all that much to me as a fan, a viewer, a critic, if they're not doing good work at the same time. Part 5. Conclusion. AKA, I would like so much to go back to studying other wrestlers now. Chris Jericho is not the greatest wrestler of all time, but he's also far from the worst. He had a successful career, was a good to great performer for a decent chunk of it, and if he had retired in 2016 or even the tail end of 2019, maybe he'd have a little more goodwill from more people. But as things stand right now, his legacy continues to erode as his time in AEW exposes some of the flaws in his game. Some of that's not his fault. The man's getting older, and the physical aspects of pro wrestling can only get more difficult for him with time unless he finds some way to compensate for that lack. He's also being exposed by being at his least compelling while surrounded by all-time talents like Danielson, Punk, or Kingston. At the same time, something interesting happened as I was in the editing process of this video. Jericho had the match with Eddie Kingston I talked about earlier, and their feud continued on. Unnecessarily, perhaps, but with a pretty good promo on Jericho's part as well as Eddie's, of course. It's some of the best work Jericho's done in over a decade, and that's extremely frustrating to me because it could have been this way the whole time. So while Jericho's story isn't quite concluded, there remains opportunities for him to be part of good and even great things. It's that massive lack in so many other different moments and opportunities that keep him from the highest echelons of pro wrestling. He could have been this good the whole time, but it took a better wrestler in Eddie Kingston to bring it to the surface. But hey, that's still something, right? There's somehow some room for growth there, where I had initially just written off his years of value entirely. That's kind of neat that he can still have these kinds of moments, even though I highly doubt that he forges a path to the very top of wrestling history anytime soon. If anything, it's at least cool that people can still surprise you, even when you think it's far too late. I do think the fervor around Jericho has seemed to die down with time, as he's phased out of the main event scene in AEW and put into divisive programs like his feud with Dan Lambert. It feels that the hype for Jericho is heading to a point where it might match where I feel his legacy actually lies. Chris Jericho deserves to be recognized for the good work he's put out in pro wrestling. He's had great matches, he's had great feuds, he's worked consistently on pro wrestling television for close to 3 decades now. However, that shouldn't blind us to his faults. In all that time, Jericho never felt like he ever hit the absolute highest levels that his peers and legends of the past were able to set. His in-ring abilities took a while to perfect and deteriorated quickly soon after. His mic abilities have a ceiling that he struggles to break because his material hasn't evolved since the late 90s, and he has a tendency to lean on shtick more than substance. He's someone who has focused on dazzling by changing the minute aesthetic things about his presentation because the core of his work has stayed mostly the same and eventually gotten much worse. Chris Jericho is a limited wrestler who more often than not reached beyond what he could achieve. And you know what? Sometimes he was able to touch that greatness that he so desired. But more often than not, he fell short because he just didn't have the ability to make it work. Chris Jericho's case as the greatest of all time? More sizzle than steak, more volume than meaning. A tale of sound and fury. signifying nothing. Thank you so much for making it all the way to the end of the video. You are absolutely amazing, and there's a few people that I especially want to thank before this video is over. I want to send a massive thank you to SamTheVAMod for once again being an absolutely amazing editor and helping me put this thing together. This video was a monster, and it couldn't be done without SamTheVAMod. I want to thank Sam's friend, Bry, for doing the wonderful artwork that's the top of the video. In the intro, that beautiful drawing of Chris Jericho. Check out Bry on their Instagram @BryAndTheMoon and on Twitter @TheMoonAndBry. I also want to send a thank you to some of my fellow YouTubers who lent their voices to this video in Chris O'Brien, Andos, Nova, Cherry Chase. These guys all do absolutely fantastic video essays about pro wrestling and other stuff as well. They have way more diversity than I do. Check out their channels. I'll link those in the description down below. And of course, a huge thank you to all my supporters on Ko-fi. Thank you to the one-time supporters in Matthew Winalski, Thurman, Nasir Senpai, and 630 Centon. And a huge thank you to all my monthly supporters in James Draper, Captain Jack Hartless, Eddie Roberts, Jacob Dickens, Matt Brummett, Chick Fritz, Spiders in My Bed, Timothy R. Buchner, Indelaine, Don O'Matic, Peter Vinnison, Kid Kingpin, Joe Humphreys, Christopher Jackson, Saltine Daltine, Dustin Faulkner, Edgar Molina, Four Pillars of Hell, Sean Emily, Mason Rollison, Carve Cutta, Jacob VR, Andrew Perry, Craig Jones, Merch Table Mafia, Clem DK, Suit Coat Man, and Ando Commando. You guys are absolutely fantastic. Thank you for helping keeping the channel going. You guys all rule so much. Thank you, and have a good one.